Hey there friends, it's Laurie. Thanks so much for stopping by. Today I'm making 3 patriotic DIYs. I used Dollar Tree supplies along with some things that I had on hand. I really hope you enjoy them, so let's get busy. I'm starting my American flag frame by using one of the 5x7 frames from the Dollar Tree. This one is blue with a rustic finish, and it's what I was looking for, but you can use any type of frame at all. I opened it up, removed the paper insert, and then replaced the back. And now that I'm done, I'm just placing it to the side. To make the stars for my flag, if you have white burlap, you can omit this next step. And if you don't, cut a 2 3/4 inch piece out of the Dollar Tree burlap. I want to turn it white, so I'm now using my white acrylic paint and a foam paintbrush and painting the front and the back. Now that my burlap has dried, I'm going to be adding on the stars, and I'm using some of these self-adhesive stars. I think you can pick them up at the Dollar Tree. I already had mine on hand. Instead of using these stars, you can always paint them on or even stencil. I'm adding the silver ones, but you can use any color you'd like, and I'm adding 3 to the top and the bottom and 2 in the center. And as I'm adding them, I'm doing my best to keep my spacing even. Once I have them all in place, I then make sure they're completely pressed down. Now that I'm done, I'm going to use some of my blue acrylic paint along with my stencil brush, and if you don't have one, you can very lightly use the end of your foam brush. I added a small amount of blue paint on the bottom of my stencil brush and then dabbed it on the burlap. I continued adding on a small amount of paint and just dabbing it on, and I made sure I didn't make it too heavy so that it could sneak to the underside of the burlap. I let the paint completely dry, and now all I'm doing is peeling off the stars. In addition to the burlap, I'm also using a 5/8 of an inch red gingham ribbon that I picked up at the Dollar Tree, along with some pieces of white 1/2 inch ribbon that I had on hand. I cut 2 red gingham and 1 white 2 1/2 inch ribbons. I'm centering my flag in the middle of the frame, and I'm just kind of eyeballing it. Once I have my stars in place, I'm then adding on my 2 1/2 inch ribbons. To add on my next stripe of white ribbon, I'm measuring it out and cutting it to size, and it measures about 5 inches. I then measure and cut a stripe of gingham, a stripe of white, and another stripe of gingham. And this is meant to be kind of a rustic piece, so if the ribbons all aren't exactly perfect, not to worry. Happy with their placement, I'm using my Mod Podge to attach them to the glass pane. I added a generous amount onto the back of the burlap and pressed it into place. I then added my Mod Podge directly onto the glass and attached all of my ribbons. Once I had all my ribbons in place, I just kind of ran my fingers over them to make sure they were flat and there were no air bubbles. When I was done, I let it set up for about 5 minutes or so, and then once again, using my Mod Podge, I gave it a complete coat, but this time on the top. I'm going to make a pole for my flag, and I'm using one of the wooden skewers from the Dollar Tree. I measured it on the side of my flag, marked it, and then cut it to size. And now using my gray acrylic paint, I'm giving it a coat. While that's drying, I'm removing the glass panel and the backing from the frame. I'm now adding some E6000 along the inside edge of the frame where the glass panel sits. When I'm done, I then return the glass panel into place, and I'm just kind of bending over those tabs to help hold it while it sets up. With my flagpole now dry, I'm using the same E6000 and running some along one edge. I'm then attaching it onto the side of the flag. I wanted to pop in and share with you today that I'm collabing with my friend Sarah from Jujubee DIY. Her channel is filled with super cute projects and DIYs, and I'll have it linked below so you can go on over and check her out. If you're new to my channel, please consider clicking on that little red subscribe button below and leaving me a big thumbs up. And if you're one of my returning friends, you know I'm always so happy to see you. While I have my gray paint out, I want to tone down the outside blue edge just a bit. I added some gray paint to the end of my paper towel, and then I lightly ran it along the edges of the frame. I gave it a minute to dry, then turned it over and removed those black tabs. I'm adding a hanger onto my frame, and I'm using some of the jute from the Dollar Tree. I cut about 18 inches in length, and then using my E6000, I attached it onto the back. To give the hanger a little more support, I used a craft stick. I cut it in half, and then using my E6000, I attached it over the two jute ends. I'm using some of the Dollar Tree wooden letters to spell out USA. I'm then using my red, white, and blue acrylic paint and giving each a coat. Once they're dry, and because I want this to be a bit rustic, I'm using a piece of sandpaper, and I'm just kind of roughing up the edges on my three letters. Now that I'm done, I'm using my E6000 and attaching them to the front of the frame. To finish up, I found these adhesive foam stars at Michael's. They were the right color gray, and they actually looked kind of high-end, so I'm adding 4 small ones to each corner on the frame. And now that I'm done, my USA American flag frame is ready to hang. I'm starting my Patriotic Gnome by using one of the wood cutouts from the Dollar Tree. I removed the hang tag, and with my red acrylic paint, I'm painting the bottom of his legs. Once that's done, I'm then using my white acrylic paint and painting his beard. I'm giving my gnome a real beard, and I'm using this mop head from the Dollar Tree. Using my scissors, I cut off about 14 strands, but you can always use a little more or a little less. Before I permanently attach them, I want to find their placement. For the shorter side pieces of the beard, I'm cutting the strands in half and then lying them in place. Once I have them cut, I'm placing the ends on the top of his painted beard. As I'm adding the strands, I'm tucking one tightly next to the other. When I come to the center, I'm leaving them longer and then just kind of trimming them off where his beard ends. Now that I have all the strands in place, I'm going to turn my gnome around and attach them with my glue gun. As I'm gluing them into place, I continue to line them up next to each other because they do have a tendency to try to move around a bit. If you like gnomes, I have made a variety of different types of gnomes, and I will have that playlist linked below in case you'd like to check it out. Once the beard has cooled and it's attached in place, I'm then going to unravel each of the strands. Now that I'm done, I'm using my scissors and I'm going to trim up the beard and give it a nice shape. And I'm using the wooden beard underneath as my guide to how long and short I want the sides and the bottom. To make my gnome 3D, I'm using a 1-inch wooden knob that I had on hand. It has a flat bottom, but if you don't have any of these, you can always use one of the plastic ping pong balls from the Dollar Tree. Those work great too. I'm painting mine with a coral color, but you can paint yours any color you'd like. When it's dry and to attach it, I'm using my E6000. Once that's added, I'm backing it up with some hot glue, and that just kind of helps hold it in place until the E6000 sets up. I'm making some arms for my gnome, and I'm using some ribbon that I found at Joann Fabrics. It's 1.5 inch, and it was actually 50% off. I measured the ribbon from the gnome's shoulder to the middle of his beard. I then cut it to size and cut a matching piece. To make the gnome's arms, I'm adding some hot glue to the center of one ribbon and then folding in the two sides. And after I made my first one, I then made my second. To attach them, I folded over about 2 inches on the gnome's shoulder and then hot glued the arm into place. I matched the two hands up in the front and then followed the same instructions. I then added on a dot of hot glue and attached the hands together. To make the gnome's hat, I'm using a 2.5 inch wired ribbon that I also picked up at Joann's, and it was half price. I'm placing the ribbon over the gnome's nose and covering the shoulders. And I'm also leaving enough on the back to basically cover it. I'm leaving the ribbon in place and adding a line of hot glue on the gnome's nose and then attaching it. I'm then attaching the two pieces onto the back. I'm now following the same instructions for my next piece, and I'm slightly overlapping the first. If you don't happen to have ribbon on hand, you can always substitute a piece of fabric. Before I add on my next piece, I'm tucking a little polyfill under the ribbon to fill in the open void. And now I'm adding on my second piece of ribbon, slightly overlapping my first, and then attaching it onto the back. And once again, to give the hat a fuller appearance, I tucked a bit of polyfill under the ribbon. And once again, I'm adding my next piece of ribbon. I'm measuring it and cutting it and then attaching it to the hat. Once I had it glued in place, I then once again tucked a tiny piece of polyfill under the ribbon. To add my last piece, I'm going to slightly overlap the top ribbon. This time I'm making a point on the top and then gathering my ribbon and cutting it. I'm making sure to keep it pinched together, and then I'm adding some hot glue and attaching it. I'm adding an accent around my gnome's hat, and I'm using some jute from the Dollar Tree. I added a dot of hot glue to the back of the hat, attached the jute, and then wrapped it around. I wrapped mine around 5 or 6 times. I cut off the excess and attached the end onto the back with my glue gun. I pulled a daisy off of this bunch that I had on hand and then hot glued it onto the center of the jute. To accent my gnome's hands, I'm using one of these sparkly paper stars that I picked up at Joann's. Using my hot glue gun, I attached it over the gnome's hands. I'm also adding on a red and a blue felt star, and I picked this package up at Michael's. They're both self-adhesive, so I just peeled off the back and added them to the silver star. I want to make my gnome a base, so I'm using a wooden heart that I had on hand, and it's thick enough to hold his weight, and I'm painting it with the same red acrylic paint that I used on his legs. While that's drying, I'm putting together the gnome stand, and I'm using 6 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. I'm using my glue gun and attaching 2 sets of 3 together. I'm now adding some hot glue to the back of my gnome and attaching the blocks to become the stand. Now that my heart is dry, I'm adding some E6000 to the bottom of the base and some hot glue onto the heart, then attaching the two together. The hot glue will help hold it in place until the E6000 sets up. To finish up, I'm using one of the Dollar Tree's American flags, and I'm tucking it over the gnome's arm and into its beard. And with that, this patriotic gnome is ready to celebrate. To make my patriotic hanging floral DIY, I'm using one of the decorative pencil holders from the Dollar Tree. If you can't find one of these, you can always use a tin can, and that will work great too. I'm also using the wood from one of the Dollar Tree's hanging wall shelves, and if you can't find that, you can always improvise with a piece of wood that you have on hand. I'm now using my white spray paint and giving them each a coat. Now that they're dry, I tried everything I could to get that cord that came with the shelf through the hole, and I could not do it. So I ended up using some thinner, smaller cord that I had on hand. I fed the end through, and now using my E6000, I'm attaching the holder to the front. I added a generous amount onto the back, and then lined up the bottom of the holder with the holes. After I had it centered and in place, I cut a length of cord and then fed that end through the other hole. I pulled the ties tightly in the back and let it set up overnight. Now that the holder is secured in place, I'm turning it over and I'm tying the 2 pieces of cord together tightly. And then I snipped off the excess ends. To make my hanger, I used the same cord. I cut about 18 inches or so, slipped both ends through the holes on the top, and then made a knot in the back. With that complete, I'm making a bow for the front, and I'm using 5 pieces of leftover ribbon. They're all 10 inches in length, so I'm cutting them down to 8 and then dovetailing the ends. Dovetailing is super easy. You fold the ribbon in half and then cut away the end at an angle. With my ribbons all cut and dovetailed, I'm layering one on top of the other, folding them in half to find the center, giving them a little pinch, and then attaching them together with a piece of floral wire. When I was done, I turned my bow over and cut off the excess wire. I added a generous amount of hot glue onto the front of my holder and attached the bow. To cover the wire in the center of the bow, I'm using a self-adhesive felt star that I found at Michael's. I removed the backing, added on a little hot glue, and attached it in the center. I'm going to be adding in some flowers, and to help hold them in place, I'm using a piece of the Dollar Tree styrofoam. I added some hot glue to the bottom of the holder and then just attached it in place. I'm using some pretty patriotic red, white, and blue flowers from the Dollar Tree. I cut each into separate stems, and now I'm adding them to my patriotic holder. Now that I have them all in place, I'm going to add one more accent, and I'm using one of the patriotic balloon holders from the Dollar Tree. I removed the cluster of shiny grass from the center, added it into my holder, and then just kind of spread it out amongst the flowers. Now that I'm done, my patriotic floral holder is ready to hang. Thanks again for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed making these patriotic DIYs with me. If you're new to my channel and you're thinking, hey, I'd like to come back and hang out with her again, don't forget to click that little red subscribe button below. I'll see you all very soon. Bye, everybody.